In my last video, I talked about how Martin Luther King Jr. was able to fight the intolerance and the racism of his day without himself giving into hatred and intolerance towards those who were oppressing him. And in this video, I'm going to talk about how he was able to not only not give into hate, but to also fight something that could be just as damaging, and that would be apathy and despair. For a lot of people like Martin Luther King Jr. that stand in a place where they're trying to affect social change, they're trying to actually look at their societies and bring it to a better place, most of them start out very optimistic. But eventually, over time of trying to change things and seeing that they just keep hitting brick wall after brick wall, they end up becoming more or less apathetic and more or less in the state where they don't believe that real change can ever actually happen. They think that things can actually move, but they just believe that there's something far deeper that is wrong with our societies that they are powerless to actually impact and change. I believe that Beatrice Webb was one such person, and I think she worded it very well. You see, Beatrice Webb was one of the forerunners and the architects for the modern day welfare system, both in Europe, where she lived, as well as in our country today. And in the beginning of her crusade and in the beginning of her campaign to try to effect change in her own society and bring about equality and betterment for all the people around her, she said in her journal, "I have staked everything on the fundamental goodness of mankind." Meaning what she believed inherently was that human beings were basically good, that we were good, decent people, but systems and unjust laws had made us turn evil. And if we could just affect the system, if we could just affect these evil laws, then finally people would be freed up to be equitable and loving and caring and charitable to one another. And after 35 years of fighting the systemic issues of her own country, she went back into that same journal entry and she wrote something completely different. This is what she said. She said, "Now, 35 years later, I realize how permanent are the evil impulses and instincts that are within us, and how little they seem to change. Like greed for wealth and power, and how mere social machinery will never change that. We must ask better things from human nature, but will we ever get a response? No amount of science or knowledge has been of any avail, and unless we curb the bad influences and impulses, how will we get better social institutions?" So in other words, this is what she's saying. She began her career by believing that people were good, but society was bad. But then at the end of her career, she realized that society was bad because it's made up of people, and that the real issue with our societies, the real issues with our countries, stem from something that's inherently wrong with the human heart. And she realized that no matter what she did, she couldn't change the human heart. All she could do was change society, but the human heart remained untouched. And she believed that if you couldn't change the human heart, you haven't changed anything of real importance. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. said much the same thing, but he looked at it with a much more optimistic lens than Beatrice Webb did. This is from his speech, The Other America. Notice how he says essentially the same thing, yet he comes to a completely different conclusion. He says this, "It is true that the law cannot change the heart of man." He totally agreed with her. He's like, I get it. You can change society all you want, but you can't change the man who's in society. You can get rid of systemic racism, which America has widely done, but you can't get rid of the individual racist. And unfortunately, the individual racist is in every level of the society. So what can you do? Now listen to what he says. "However, the law can't change the heart of man, but it can restrain the heartless. Even though it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can stop him from lynching me." And I think that's pretty important. And so, while the law may not change the hearts of men, it can and it does change the habits of men. And when you change the habits, soon attitudes will be changed, and pretty soon the hearts will be changed also. And then he finishes the speech by saying this, "We are going to win our freedom, both because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands." In other words, what Martin Luther King believed is he believed, just like Beatrice Webb, you can't change the heart of man, but you can change the habits through the laws. However, while she at that point threw up her hands and said, you can't actually affect any massive or eternal change, Martin Luther King Jr. disagreed. And he instead said, yes, I can do these things. I can change the system, but I believe in a power greater than myself that will change the heart. He believed that there was a power outside of society that was able to change the heart of man, which would then in turn change the society of man. And he believed so firmly, not only that there was a power that could do this, but he also believed that there was a power that would do this. That's what enabled him to encounter so many roadblocks and so many issues and still remain optimistic. Why? Because he never bet his entire security of what he was trying to accomplish on whether or not he can change the heart of man. He knew he couldn't do that, but he believed in someone who could. And I believe that his hopes and his also understanding of this issue is very well summarized by a woman named Dorothy Sayers. Now, Dorothy Sayers was an Oxford Fellow. She was someone who graduated from Oxford, one of the first women to ever do that, by the way. And she was a very close friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. She wrote some fiction literature during that time. Now, after World War II and during some of the Cold War instances that were going on, she was asked by some of her colleagues to write a paper about why things seemed to be going so bad. And here's why she was asked to do that. During her day, and this is the same true for our day as well, most of the intellectuals that were living around her time believed that science and reason were going to be such forces for good, that they were going to civilize our society so much that human beings would become incredibly civilized. It would be kind of like Star Trek. There'd be no more money, there'd be no war, we would just go out and explore and love one another, and it would be great. That was kind of what people believed during her day. But then they were shaken when World War II happened. And it wasn't some uncivilized civilization that was coming against them. It was the most civilized civilizations that were alive at that time. It was the Germans. Some of the most educated and well-thought people in that time all of a sudden rose up and started to massively exterminate whole groups of people. In fact, the barbarity that the Nazis inflicted on mankind was more severe than anything that mankind had seen previously, and probably anything that we're going to see after. Beyond that, not only did you see the horrible barbarity of what Hitler did, but you saw the horrible barbarity of what the Allies had to do in response. We had to firebomb whole cities in Germany without a single military base. Beyond that, we had to nuke 2 cities in Japan. These are horrible actions. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed as a result of these actions in order to stop the gears of war that were threatening to destroy all of society. And even as bad as that is, though, the Cold War was even worse. She didn't know this at the time, but the things that Joseph Stalin were going to do were going to make the things that Hitler did seem like small potatoes. Joseph Stalin killed over 30 million people in his own country. Then, from his own communist regime came other communist regimes that killed more millions of people. I'm talking about Pol Pot and the killing fields, Mao Zedong, and other people like that. You had horrible, horrible atrocities happening by who? Educated people who believed in science. Our reason and our rationale did not civilize us, but it actually made us more dangerous, it seemed. And she was responding to this unbelievable amount of apathy and pessimism that was spreading like wildfire in her community. And she wrote this incredible essay in which she says this: to them, or speaking to her colleagues, to her fellows, the appalling outbursts and the bestial ferocity of the totalitarian states, speaking of the both the fascists and the communists, and the obstinate selfishness and the stupid greed of the capitalist society, now speaking of her own country, are not merely shocking and alarming. For them, these things are the utter negation of everything that they had believed. It is the thought that is dropped out the bottom of their universe. In other words, what she's saying is because they believed so much in the civilizing power of society, when they saw these evil atrocities happen, they came to the place where they're like, why even bother? There's no hope. Mankind cannot be civilized. We are beyond hope and beyond any type of civilizing effect. However, this is how she ends that speech. She says this: however, the Christian dogma of the dual nature of man, which asserts that man is disintegrated and necessarily imperfect in himself and all of his works, yet closely related to, and by a real unity of substance with eternal perfection within and beyond him, makes the present parlous state of human society seem less hopeless and far less irrational. This is what she's saying. For the Christian, when we look at the things happening in our society right now, we should not be shocked. Grieved, yes. Shocked, no. This is exactly what we should expect to happen because mankind outside of God is disintegrated from our own self-interest. We are capable of every sort of wickedness outside of God. That's what Christians have believed for the last 2 millennia. However, what we also believe is that even though mankind is fallen and capable of every wickedness, we also believe that mankind, whether saved or not, is made in the image and likeness of God and therefore bears an imprint of his character qualities and therefore his inherent goodness. So therefore, we also believe that mankind is able to be civilized and is able to be changed because we also reside in that image of God. And it doesn't actually require salvation for someone to be changed. But what she ultimately believed in, and this is the same thing that Martin Luther King Jr. also believed in, is that ultimately mankind would be completely changed by an event that happened in the life and death of Christ. What she believed is that this eternal perfection, which seems so far and distant from the present state of mankind's fallenness, actually came to draw near to the fallenness of mankind, take it on, and die in our place. In other words, as the Apostle Paul puts it, he who knew no sin became sin that we might become the righteousness of God. That Jesus brought us close to the eternal perfection of the Creator, so therefore the heart of man can be changed and will be changed by those who receive him. So for Martin Luther King Jr., he continued to preach and he continued to fight, knowing that those who could be saved would be saved by the power of God, not by his own mere human efforts. And that through their salvation they would be regenerated and changed into people who are no longer intolerant and no longer bigotous, but instead loving and caring and forgiving, just as his Father had made him that way. But he also believed that there would be people that would reject this promise, and they would continue in their hatred, they would continue in their intolerance, and they would eventually be separated from God forever. Meaning that Martin Luther King did not have to spend his time fretting over the success of the evil people around him. He didn't have to spend his time being consumed by bitterness and hatred because he knew God is going to deal with those people. God is going to handle their lives and God is going to handle their eternity. I don't have to worry about them. But what I can do is I can continue to preach and I continue to speak and I can continue to move, knowing that there will be people who will listen, there will be people who will be changed, and miracles will happen from my time up until the time where Jesus will come back and make all things right. And that same perspective that enabled him to not slip into pessimism should be spoken to us today. So many Christians and non-Christians have looked at the society today and given up hope. And that's not something we should be doing. We should instead take hold of the same hope of future justice that Martin Luther King had. And we should be able to walk forward knowing that God will make things right, that he will change things. So while we don't put all hope in our own efforts, we know that God will be successful, and we want to be a part of his army and his plan for redemption, and that's why we move forward. So in my next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the heart of the racist can and is changed by the glory of God. But look forward to that. Please put any comments below of what you guys think about what's going on in our country right now, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.